In 1892, when a woman's worth was measured by her purity and a single mistake could destroy her entire future, Margaret O'Sullivan stepped off a dusty train in Wyoming Territory carrying more than just her worn leather suitcase. Hidden beneath her carefully arranged dress was a secret that would either damn her forever or lead her to the most unexpected love story of the frontier. What happens when society's rules collide with human compassion? When a man's character is tested not by his strength with a rifle, but by his willingness to love a child that isn't his own. This is the true story of a woman who dared to hope for acceptance, a man who chose love over convention, and a community that learned what family really means. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the heaviest hearts, and sometimes the most beautiful families are born not from blood but from choice. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her palm against the train window, watching the endless prairie stretch before her like a golden ocean. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on steel tracks had become the soundtrack to her anxiety over the past 4 days. With each mile that carried her further from Boston, she felt the weight of her secret growing heavier. At 22, she was traveling to Wyoming Territory to marry a man she had never met, carrying a child that wasn't his. The letter that had started this journey was folded carefully in her reticule. Read so many times the creases had worn soft. Seeking a God-fearing woman for marriage. Must be of good character and willing to work hard on a cattle ranch. No drinkers or women of questionable morals need apply. She had responded to Samuel Hartford's advertisement 3 months ago, when her situation had become impossible to hide much longer. Her responses to his letters had been carefully crafted lies, painting herself as a spinster schoolteacher seeking a new life in the West. The truth was far more complicated. Margaret had been employed as a seamstress in one of Boston's finer dress shops when she caught the attention of the owner's son, Charles Whitmore. He was handsome, charming, and everything a young woman from her modest background could dream of. For 6 months, he courted her with promises of marriage and a life of comfort. She had believed his whispered declarations of love, his assurances that they would marry as soon as he could convince his father to accept their union. The night she gave herself to him, trusting in his promises, had been the beginning of her downfall. When she told Charles about the baby 2 months later, his reaction shattered every dream she had dared to nurture. "You must be mistaken about who the father is," he had said coldly, as if she were a stranger rather than the woman he had claimed to love. "My family has a reputation to maintain. I suggest you find a solution to your problem that doesn't involve me." Within a week, she had been dismissed from the dress shop. Charles's father had made sure no respectable establishment in Boston would employ her. The women who had once been her friends turned away when they saw her on the street. Even her own family, strict Irish Catholics who valued their reputation in their tight-knit community, had made it clear she was no longer welcome in their home. With nowhere to turn and her condition becoming more apparent each day, Margaret had seen Samuel Hartford's advertisement as her only hope. The frontier was known for offering second chances to those willing to work for them. She had spent her last savings on the train ticket west, praying that somehow she could build a new life for herself and her unborn child. The conductor's voice cut through her memories as he announced they would be arriving in Cheyenne within the hour. Margaret's hands trembled as she smoothed her dark green traveling dress, chosen specifically because its full skirt helped disguise her growing belly. At 5 months pregnant, she could still hide her condition with the right clothing and careful posture, but she knew her time was running out. Samuel's last letter had mentioned he would be waiting at the station with a preacher, hoping to complete their marriage ceremony immediately so they could travel to his ranch together as husband and wife. The plan had seemed reasonable when she was safely across the country, but now the reality of deceiving a man at their wedding altar made her stomach churn with more than just morning sickness. As the train pulled into the station, Margaret caught her first glimpse of Cheyenne. The town was smaller than she had expected, with wooden buildings lining dusty streets and mountains visible in the distance. Cowboys and ranchers moved about their business, their faces weathered by sun and wind. Everything about this place was different from the brick buildings and cobblestone streets of Boston. She gathered her few belongings and made her way to the platform, scanning the crowd for a man who might match Samuel's description. He had written that he was tall with dark hair and would be wearing his best suit for their meeting. Several men fit that general description, but one stood apart from the others. He was indeed tall, with broad shoulders and kind brown eyes that seemed to be searching for someone. When their eyes met, he stepped forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss O'Sullivan?" His voice was deeper than she had expected, with a slight drawl that spoke of years spent in the West. "I'm Samuel Hartford. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." "Mr. Hartford." She accepted his offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work, and the gentleness with which he helped her down from the train. The journey was long, but I'm grateful to finally be here. Samuel retrieved her trunk and carpet bag, handling them easily despite their weight. I've arranged for us to marry this afternoon, if you're not too tired. Reverend Mitchell is waiting at the church, and then we can head out to the ranch. It's about a 2-hour ride, and I'd like to arrive before dark.
Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. In just a few hours she would be standing before God and this good man, promising to love and honor him while hiding the most important truth about herself.
That sounds fine, she managed to say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. As they walked toward his wagon, Samuel glanced at her with concern. Are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale. The altitude here can take some getting used to for folks from back east. She seized on the excuse gratefully.
Yes. I think that must be it.
Perhaps some water would help. Samuel helped her into the wagon and produced a canteen from beneath the seat. The water was cool and fresh, and she drank gratefully while studying his profile. He had a strong jaw and laughed lines around his eyes that suggested he was a man who found joy in life. There was an honesty about him that made her deception feel even more terrible. Tell me about your ranch, she said, desperate to fill the silence with something other than her racing thoughts. It's not much yet, Samuel admitted, guiding the wagon through the busy streets. I've got about 200 head of cattle and a small house. It's just 3 rooms, but it's solid and warm. I built it myself over the past 2 years. He paused, glancing at her again. I know it's not what you're used to in Boston, but I'm working to build something lasting, something a family can be proud of. The word family hit her like a physical blow. Samuel Hartford was a good man with honest dreams, and she was about to trap him in a marriage built on lies. For a moment, she considered telling him the truth right there, explaining her situation and asking for his help, without the pretense of marriage. But the memory of Charles's rejection and her family's shame kept her silent. Where would she go if Samuel turned her away? She had spent everything she had getting here. They arrived at a small white church where a middle-aged man in clerical robes waited on the steps. Reverend Mitchell, Samuel called out. I'd like you to meet my bride, Margaret O'Sullivan. The Reverend was a kind-faced man with graying hair who shook her hand warmly. Welcome to Wyoming, my dear. Samuel has been counting the days until your arrival. Are you ready to begin this new chapter of your life? Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Inside the simple church, with its wooden pews and plain glass windows, she felt the weight of what she was about to do. Samuel stood beside her at the altar, looking handsome in his best suit, completely unaware that the woman he was marrying carried another man's child. The ceremony was brief and practical, as frontier weddings often were. When Reverend Mitchell asked if she would take Samuel Hartford as her husband, to love and honor him in sickness and health, Margaret heard herself say, I do, in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper. Samuel's response was firm and confident, and when he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she noticed his hands were steady while hers shook. You may kiss your bride. Reverend Mitchell announced, and Margaret found herself looking up into Samuel's brown eyes as he leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her lips. It was her first kiss since Charles, and the tenderness of it nearly brought her to tears. As they signed the marriage certificate, Samuel's hand briefly covered hers. Are you happy, Mrs. Hartford? He asked quietly, using her new name for the first time. Margaret managed a small smile, though it felt like it might break her face. Yes, she whispered, and realized with surprise that part of her actually was. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Samuel Hartford might not love her yet, but he had chosen her, and that was more than anyone else had been willing to do. The ride to the ranch passed in comfortable conversation as Samuel pointed out landmarks and told her about their neighbors. The countryside was beautiful in a way that was completely different from New England, with wide-open spaces that seemed to stretch forever, under a sky bigger than any she had ever seen. The mountains in the distance looked purple in the afternoon light, and she found herself thinking that perhaps this harsh, beautiful land might indeed offer the fresh start she desperately needed. As the sun began to set, they crested a hill, and Samuel pointed ahead. There it is, he said with obvious pride, our home. The house was small but neat, with a covered porch and smoke rising from the chimney. A barn and several outbuildings sat nearby, and she could see cattle grazing in a fenced pasture. It wasn't grand, but it looked solid and welcoming, like a place where people could build a life together. It's beautiful, Margaret said, and meant it. Compared to the cramped boarding house room she had been living in back in Boston, this looked like a palace. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and carried her bags to the front door. "I know we don't know each other well yet," he said, pausing before opening the door, "but I want you to know that I'm committed to making this marriage work. I believe two people can build love together if they're willing to try." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. If only he knew how much she wanted to believe that was true. "Thank you, Samuel," she managed to say. "That means more than you know." He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. The interior was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area, a bedroom, and a smaller room that Samuel explained he used as an office. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though it clearly lacked a woman's touch. "I'll let you get settled," Samuel said, setting her bags down in the bedroom. "I need to check on the cattle before it gets too dark. There's stew keeping warm on the stove if you're hungry, and I'll be back in about an hour." When he left, Margaret sank into a chair at the kitchen table and finally allowed herself to cry. The relief of having a roof over her head and a name that offered protection was overwhelming, but so was the guilt of deceiving the kind man who had just married her. She placed her hands over her belly where the baby was beginning to show signs of movement. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered. "I know this isn't the way things should be, but I promise I'll do everything I can to give you a good life. Maybe someday your stepfather will love you too if he doesn't hate us both when he learns the truth." As she unpacked her few belongings in her new home, Margaret tried to push down the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had perhaps 4 months before her pregnancy became impossible to hide. 4 months to figure out how to tell Samuel the truth without losing everything she had just gained. 4 months to somehow turn a marriage built on deception into something real and lasting. Outside, she could hear Samuel moving around the barn, tending to his animals with the same careful attention he had shown her. He was a good man who deserved better than a wife who would lie to him from the very beginning. But she was here now, and somehow she had to make this work. For her sake, for her baby's sake, and maybe even for Samuel's sake too. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of beef stew, and for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to hope that maybe, somehow, everything would work out. She had made it this far on faith and determination. Perhaps that would be enough to carry her through whatever came next. The first weeks of marriage passed more peacefully than Margaret had dared to hope. Samuel was patient and considerate, giving her time to adjust to her new life while working alongside her to establish their routine. He rose before dawn to tend the cattle, returning for breakfast that Margaret prepared with ingredients from his well-stocked larder. Their conversations were polite and careful, two strangers learning to navigate the intimate spaces of shared daily life. Samuel had insisted she take the bedroom while he made himself comfortable on a cot in his office, explaining that they should take time to know each other properly before becoming husband and wife in all ways. His consideration touched her deeply, even as it intensified her guilt about the secret she carried. Every night, as she lay alone in the marriage bed, Margaret placed her hands on her growing belly and whispered prayers for wisdom and forgiveness. The physical demands of ranch life were unlike anything she had experienced in Boston. Water had to be carried from the well, wood chopped for the stove, and meals prepared from basic ingredients rather than purchased ready-made from shops. Her hands, once soft from her work as a seamstress, began to develop calluses from washing clothes in lye soap and kneading bread dough. Samuel noticed her struggles and patiently taught her the skills she needed, never once expressing frustration when she burned biscuits or struggled to manage the temperamental wood stove. "You're doing fine," he assured her one morning when she apologized for serving him eggs that were overdone on one side and runny on the other. "I've been batching it for so long I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone care enough to cook for me at all. Give it time." His kindness made her deception feel even more unbearable. Margaret found herself studying his face during their meals together, memorizing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, and the gentle way he spoke to the ranch dogs that followed him everywhere. She was beginning to care for this man who had married a stranger out of loneliness and hope, and the knowledge that her lies would eventually destroy whatever trust they were building made her feel sick with more than just pregnancy nausea. The morning sickness that had plagued her for months began to ease, but other changes were becoming harder to hide. Her dresses, already let out as much as possible, were growing uncomfortably tight across her middle. She took to wearing her apron constantly and standing behind chairs or tables when Samuel was in the house. At night, she examined herself in the mirror by lamplight, trying to calculate how much longer she could maintain the pretense. 3 weeks after their wedding, Samuel's neighbor Tom Bradley stopped by to meet the new Mrs. Hartford. Tom was a weathered man in his 50s who owned the ranch to the south, and he brought his wife Ellen along for the introduction. Margaret had been dreading this moment, knowing that other women would be more likely to notice signs of her condition than Samuel had been. Ellen Bradley was a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair and a direct manner that reminded Margaret of her mother. She looked Margaret up and down with frank curiosity as they sat in the main room drinking coffee and eating the cake Margaret had nervously prepared that morning. "So you came all the way from Boston," Ellen said, settling her considerable frame into one of Samuel's hand-built chairs. "That's quite a journey for a young woman to make alone." "What made you decide to answer Sam's advertisement?" Margaret had prepared for this question, but under Ellen's penetrating gaze, her rehearsed answer felt flimsy.
I was tired of city life,
she said carefully. "I wanted something different, a chance to build a life in a place where hard work mattered more than family connections." Ellen's eyes seemed to take in every detail of Margaret's appearance, from her carefully arranged hair to the way she held her teacup. "And what did you do in Boston? Sam mentioned you were a teacher." The lie came easier now, having been repeated in letters. "I taught at a small school for working women, helping them learn to read and write. At least that part wasn't entirely false. She had helped some of the younger seamstresses with their letters during breaks at the dress shop. Tom and Samuel were deep in conversation about cattle prices and the upcoming roundup, but Margaret felt Ellen's attention like a physical weight. When the older woman offered to help clear the dishes, Margaret reluctantly followed her into the kitchen area. "You seem nervous, dear," Ellen said quietly as they stacked plates. "Is everything all right? Marriage can be an adjustment, especially when you're starting with a stranger." Margaret's hands trembled as she poured hot water into the washing basin. "I'm fine, thank you. Just still getting used to everything." Ellen studied her for a long moment, and Margaret had the unsettling feeling that the older woman could see right through her. "If you ever need to talk woman to woman, you know where to find me. Sometimes it helps to have another female to confide in, especially when you're far from family." When the Bradleys left, Samuel seemed pleased with how the visit had gone. "Tom thinks you're a fine woman," he told Margaret as they watched the couple's wagon disappear down the dusty road. "Ellen can be a bit stern, but she's got a good heart. It'll be nice for you to have another woman nearby." Margaret nodded and smiled, though Ellen's penetrating questions had left her more nervous than ever. If their closest neighbor's wife suspected something was amiss, how long before Samuel began to notice the changes in her body that she was working so hard to conceal? The answer came sooner than she expected. A week later, Samuel returned from checking the north pasture earlier than usual to find Margaret bent over a wash basin in the yard, retching violently. She had been feeling sick all morning but had hoped to hide it from him as she had been doing for weeks when the nausea struck. Samuel dropped his hat and rushed to her side, placing a gentle hand on her back as another wave of sickness overtook her. "What's wrong? Should I ride for the doctor?" "No," she gasped, accepting the damp cloth he offered and pressing it to her face. "I'm sure it's just something I ate. I'll be fine in a moment." But Samuel's concerned expression didn't clear as he helped her into the house and settled her in a chair. "You've been looking pale lately," he said, studying her face with new attention. "And you've barely touched your food at meals. Maybe we should have Doc Harrison take a look at you." "Really, I'm fine," Margaret insisted, though even she could hear how weak her voice sounded. "It's probably just the change in climate and diet. I'm not used to such rich food after the simple meals I had in Boston." Samuel looked unconvinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he insisted she rest while he prepared a simple meal of bread and broth. As Margaret lay on the sofa, watching him move carefully around the kitchen, she realized that his growing concern would soon make it impossible to hide the truth. The man she was beginning to love was going to discover that she had built their entire relationship on lies. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Samuel broached a subject that made Margaret's blood run cold. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down the harness he was mending. "Maybe it's time we talked about starting a family. I know we agreed to take things slowly, but we're married now, and I'd like children someday. I was wondering how you felt about that." Margaret's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. "A family," she repeated faintly. "I know it might seem soon to discuss it," Samuel said, misinterpreting her reaction as nervousness about intimacy rather than panic about discovery. "But I want you to know that I'm ready for that step in our marriage when you are. I think you'd make a wonderful mother, and I'd like to have children to help with the ranch and carry on what we're building here." The irony was almost unbearable. Here was Samuel, asking for the very thing she was already carrying, while she sat paralyzed by fear of his reaction when he learned the truth. "Samuel," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I know I'm not the most romantic man, Margaret. I'm better with cattle than I am with pretty words. But I want you to know that my feelings for you are growing stronger every day. You're kind and hardworking, and I think we could build something good together. Something lasting." Margaret felt tears threatening and looked down at her hands to hide them. "You hardly know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Samuel said firmly. "I know you've been patient with me while I try to figure out how to be a husband. I know you work harder than any woman should have to without complaining. I know you're gentle with the animals and that you hum while you cook breakfast." He paused, and when she looked up, his brown eyes were warm with sincerity. "I know that I married a stranger, but I'm not married to a stranger anymore." The weight of his growing affection was almost more than Margaret could bear. Every day that passed made their eventual reckoning more painful. She was falling in love with Samuel Hartford. With his quiet strength and gentle humor, with the way he treated her, as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. But she knew that love would turn to betrayal and anger when he discovered how thoroughly she had deceived him. 2 days later, Margaret's worst fears were realized when she woke to find blood on her nightgown. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might be losing the baby, but the spotting was light and stopped quickly. Still, it was enough to send her into a panic that made her careless about hiding her condition. She was standing in front of the bedroom mirror that evening, examining her profile and worrying about the baby when Samuel appeared in the doorway. She turned quickly, but not before he had seen her hands resting protectively on her rounded belly. The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel's eyes moved from her face to her midsection, taking in the obvious curve that her loose nightgown couldn't fully disguise. His expression went through a series of changes: confusion, realization, and finally something that looked like hurt. "Margaret," he said quietly, "is there something you need to tell me?" She stood frozen, her hands still pressed to her stomach, unable to find words for the conversation she had been dreading for weeks. Samuel stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his movements careful and controlled. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 months, she admitted, the words feeling like stones in her throat. Samuel sank into the chair by the window, running his hands through his hair. 6 months, he repeated. "So you were all ready." He looked up at her, his brown eyes filled with a pain that made her stomach clench. "The whole time, the letters, the wedding, all of it. You were already carrying another man's child." Margaret wanted to go to him, to explain, to somehow make him understand that she hadn't meant for things to happen this way. But the distance between them felt like an impossible chasm. "Samuel, please let me explain." "Explain." His voice cracked slightly. "What is there to explain, Margaret? You married me under false pretenses. You let me believe I was getting an honest woman, someone who could build a real life with me. Instead, I got someone who was using me to solve a problem." "It wasn't like that," Margaret said desperately. "I mean, it was at first, but it's not anymore." "I care about you, Samuel. What we have is real." Samuel stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the dark prairie. "What we have is based on a lie. Everything I thought I knew about you, about us, is false." He turned back to her, and the betrayal in his eyes was worse than any anger would have been. "Did you think I wouldn't notice eventually? Did you plan to pass the child off as mine?" "I don't know," Margaret whispered honestly. "I was so desperate when I answered your advertisement. I had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. I thought maybe if we married quickly enough, if the baby came early." "Who is the father?" Samuel asked quietly. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. "A man in Boston. He promised to marry me, but when I told him about the baby, he denied it was his. His family made sure I lost my job and my reputation. Even my own family turned their backs on me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So you came here to find a man foolish enough to take on another man's responsibility without knowing it?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than Margaret intended. "Maybe that's how it started, but it's not what this became. I care about you, Samuel. I've come to love you. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but please believe that my feelings for you are real." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I need time to think," he said finally. "I'm going to sleep in the barn tonight. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." He left without another word, and Margaret collapsed on the bed, sobbing with relief and terror in equal measure. The secret was finally out, but she had no idea what would come next. Would Samuel send her away, demand an annulment? The thought of facing the world alone and pregnant again was almost unbearable. but she knew she had no right to expect anything else. Through the window she could see the light of Samuel's lantern in the barn.
He would be bedding down in the hay, probably wishing he had never placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride. Margaret pressed her face into the pillow that still smelled like the soap he used and wondered if this would be her last night in the home she had briefly allowed herself to believe could be hers.
Margaret barely slept that night, listening for any sound from the barn, and imagining Samuel's thoughts as he lay in the hay among his cattle. Every scenario she conjured ended the same way, with her packing her meager belongings and heading back to a world that had already rejected her once. When dawn finally broke over the prairie, she rose with heavy eyes and a heavier heart, preparing what she was certain would be her last breakfast in the Hartford kitchen. She had just started the coffee when the back door opened and Samuel entered, his hair filled with straw and his clothes wrinkled from sleeping rough. His eyes were bloodshot and his face bore the haggard expression of a man who had wrestled with demons through the dark hours. Margaret set down the coffee pot with shaking hands and turned to face whatever judgment he had reached. "Sit down, Margaret," Samuel said quietly, gesturing to the kitchen table. His voice was hoarse, whether from emotion or from the cold night air. She couldn't tell. She took her usual seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, to keep them from trembling. Samuel poured himself coffee and sat across from her, cradling the steaming mug between his palms as if seeking its warmth. For several minutes neither of them spoke.
"I've been thinking all night," Samuel finally said, not meeting her eyes, "about what you told me, about what this means for us, for everything we've been building here." Margaret's throat felt like it was closing. "Samuel, I know you have every right to send me away. I deceived you terribly, and I have no excuse that could make that acceptable. But please know that I never meant for you to be hurt by this. You're a good man, better than I deserved."
Samuel looked up at her then, and she was surprised to see not anger in his brown eyes, but something that looked almost like understanding.
I won't lie and say I'm not hurt, Margaret.
"I feel like a fool for not seeing the signs earlier, but I've been asking myself what I would have done if you had told me the truth from the beginning, in your first letter." Margaret waited, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope. "The honest answer is that I probably would have thrown your letter away and moved on to the next respondent," Samuel continued.
Not because I'm a heartless man, but because taking on another man's child and a woman with a damaged reputation would have seemed like too much risk, too much complication, for a simple rancher who just wanted a wife and a peaceful life. Each word felt like a nail, being driven into Margaret's coffin of hopes.
She nodded, accepting the inevitable rejection she had always known would come. "But that was before I knew you," Samuel said, his voice growing stronger. "Before I saw how hard you work, how kind you are, how you light up this house just by being in it. Before I realized that I care more about the woman you are now than about the circumstances that brought you here."
Margaret's head snapped up, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Samuel reached across the table and covered her trembling hands with his calloused ones.
"I'm not saying this doesn't change things between us. Trust is something that has to be rebuilt and that will take time. But I've been lying out there in the barn, thinking about how empty this place felt before you came, and I realize I don't want to go back to that emptiness." Tears began streaming down Margaret's face as Samuel continued. "The baby you're carrying is innocent of any wrongdoing. It deserves a father who will love and protect it, and a chance to grow up in a stable home. If you're willing to be completely honest with me from now on, if you're willing to work to rebuild the trust between us, then I'm willing to try to make this marriage real."
You would do that? Margaret whispered. You would raise another man's child as your own?
"I would raise our child as my own," Samuel corrected gently. "Because if I accept this baby, if I choose to be its father, then that's what it becomes. Not some other man's responsibility that I'm taking on out of charity, but my own child that I'm choosing to love."
Margaret was crying too hard to speak, overwhelmed by a generosity she had never dared to dream possible. Samuel came around the table and knelt beside her chair, pulling her into his arms as she sobbed against his shoulder.
"There will be conditions," he said softly, stroking her hair. "Complete honesty between us from now on. No more secrets, no more lies, even small ones. I need to know that I can trust you with everything, not just the big things." "Yes," Margaret managed through her tears, "anything you ask. And I want to know about the father. Not because I plan to contact him, but because someday our child might ask questions and I want to be able to give honest answers." Margaret pulled back to look at him, still hardly believing this was real. His name was Charles Whitmore. He was the son of the man who owned the dress shop where I worked. He was handsome and charming, and I was foolish enough to believe his promises of marriage. When I told him about the baby, he accused me of lying about who the father was. and made it clear that his family's reputation was more important to him than any responsibility he might have to me or the child.
Samuel's jaw tightened with anger, but his hands remained gentle on her shoulders. "He's a coward and a fool," he said firmly.
Any man who would abandon a woman carrying his child doesn't deserve the name of father. This baby will be better off with a father who chose to love it rather than one who was forced to acknowledge it.
"How can you be so generous?" Margaret asked, searching his face for any sign of hidden resentment. "How can you forgive me so easily?"
It's not easy, Samuel admitted.
I'm hurt and disappointed that you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth. But I've also been thinking about why you felt you had to lie. A woman in your situation, cast off by family and society, desperate and alone, what choices did you really have? You did what you felt you had to do to survive and protect your child.
I can't say I wouldn't have done the same thing if our positions were reversed. Margaret touched his face, memorizing the kindness she saw there. I love you, Samuel Hartford.
I know I have no right to say that after what I've done, but it's the truth. I love your gentleness, your integrity, the way you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it. I love you too, Samuel said, and the simple words hit Margaret with the force of a physical blow. I didn't expect to when I married you, but I do.
That's why this hurts so much, and it's also why I can't give up on us. They held each other in the kitchen as the morning sun streamed through the windows, both of them crying and laughing at the same time.
Margaret felt as though an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a lightness she hadn't experienced since before Charles's betrayal. "What do we tell people?" she asked as they finally separated. Practical concerns beginning to intrude on her joy. "Oh, about the baby coming so soon after our wedding?" Samuel considered this. "The truth, as much as we need to, that you were a widow when I married you, and that I'm proud to give your child my name. It's not uncommon for women to remarry quickly when they're left alone and expecting." It was a simple solution that would protect both Margaret's reputation and the child's legitimacy while staying as close to honesty as possible. "You've thought of everything," she said admiringly. "I had all night to think," Samuel replied with a tired smile. "And I want to make sure we start fresh with no more deception between us."
Which brings me to another question. When is the baby due? Margaret calculated quickly. Late February or early March, I think.
NT Tasting NTT says, Herald and Commonplace's first end.
"I'm not entirely certain of the exact date. We'll need to prepare," Samuel said, already shifting into his practical mode. "The nearest doctor is in town, but that's too far if you go into labor during a blizzard. I'll ask Ellen Bradley to help when the time comes. She's delivered plenty of babies over the years." The mention of Ellen Bradley made Margaret nervous. She suspected something when they visited. I could tell by the way she looked at me.
Ellen's a sharp woman, Samuel agreed, but she's also discreet and kind-hearted.
"If we tell her the truth, that you were a young widow when I married you, she'll help spread that story and make sure you're accepted in the community." Over the following days, Samuel proved as good as his word. He accompanied Margaret to town for supplies and introduced her to their neighbors as his beloved wife, whose first husband had died tragically young, leaving her to face motherhood alone. His protective presence and obvious affection for her made their story believable, and Margaret found herself accepted into the community with surprising warmth. Ellen Bradley proved to be particularly supportive, taking Margaret under her wing and sharing advice about pregnancy and childbirth. "You're fortunate to have found Samuel," she told Margaret one afternoon as they worked together in Margaret's kitchen, preserving vegetables for the winter. "He's one of the finest men in this territory. That baby couldn't ask for a better father." "I know," Margaret said softly, watching through the window as Samuel worked with one of his horses. "I'm more grateful than I can express." Ellen studied her with those sharp eyes. "You've had some heartache in your past, haven't you, dear? I can see it sometimes when you think no one's watching." Margaret's hand stilled on the carrots she was chopping. "Yes," she admitted, "but Samuel has given me a chance at a new life, and I'm determined to make the most of it."
Good, Ellen said firmly. The past is the past.
"What matters is what you do with the future you've been given." As autumn gave way to winter, Margaret and Samuel settled into a comfortable routine. Their marriage deepened beyond the practical partnership it had started as, becoming something built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Samuel was unfailingly gentle with Margaret as her pregnancy advanced, taking over the heavier household tasks and ensuring she had everything she needed to stay comfortable. Their neighbors began to comment on how well-suited they were to each other, how obvious it was that theirs was a love match despite its practical beginnings. Margaret sometimes caught Samuel smiling at these comments with genuine pleasure, and she realized that he took pride in being seen as a devoted husband.
One evening in December, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Samuel placed his hand on Margaret's rounded belly for the first time. The baby had been particularly active that day, and he felt the strong kick against his palm with wonder.
He's going to be a strong one, Samuel said with a grin. Or she.
Do you have a preference? As long as the baby is healthy, I don't care, Margaret said, covering his hand with hers. Though I admit I sometimes imagine a little boy who looks just like his father. Samuel's eyes met hers with understanding.
He would be this child's father in every way that mattered, and they both knew it. Have you thought about names? I was hoping you would choose, Margaret said.
Since you're the one giving this baby a family name and a future, it seems right that you should name him or her as well. Samuel was quiet for a moment, moved by the gesture. I'd like to name a son Thomas after my father. And if it's a daughter, perhaps Elizabeth, after my mother. But I want you to have a say too. Thomas Samuel Hartford, Margaret said, trying out the name. Or Elizabeth Margaret Hartford. I like them both. As they sat together in the warm glow of the fireplace, Margaret felt a peace she had never expected to find. The baby she carried would never know want or shame, would grow up secure in the knowledge of being loved and wanted. Samuel had not only accepted her child but claimed it fully, giving it the gift of legitimacy and a father's protection. Samuel, Margaret said softly, what made you decide to forgive me? Really? Samuel considered her question seriously. I suppose it was realizing that holding on to anger would hurt me more than it would hurt you, and understanding that sometimes people do desperate things not because they're bad people, but because they're out of options. He looked at her with the gentle brown eyes that had become so dear to her. You were brave enough to travel across the country alone, to build a new life from nothing. That takes courage, even if the beginning wasn't entirely honest. I want to be worthy of your faith in me, Margaret said. You already are, Samuel replied, squeezing her hand. You work hard. You care for our home and our animals. And you've brought joy into my life. That's more than enough. As winter deepened and Margaret's due date approached, their quiet household prepared for the arrival of its newest member. Samuel had transformed his office into a nursery building, a beautiful cradle from pine wood and painting the walls a cheerful yellow. Margaret had sewn tiny clothes and blankets, imagining the child who would soon fill them. Their love story had begun with deception and desperation, but it had grown into something real and lasting. Samuel Hartford had proved himself to be a man of extraordinary compassion, choosing love over convention and family over blood ties. And Margaret had learned that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as impossible situations, requiring only faith and courage to transform them into joy. The blizzard that struck Wyoming territory in late February was one of the worst anyone could remember. Snow fell for 3 straight days, piling against the windows of the Hartford house and making travel impossible. Margaret, now enormous with pregnancy and uncomfortable in every position, watched the white world outside with growing anxiety. The baby was due any day, and the storm had cut them off from all outside help. Samuel spent those 3 days in constant motion, checking and rechecking their supplies, ensuring the animals were secure, and trying to maintain a calm demeanor despite his obvious worry. He had wanted to bring Ellen Bradley to stay with them before the storm hit, but the weather had turned severe too quickly for any such arrangements. "What if the baby comes before the storm breaks?" Margaret asked on the second night, as another powerful gust of wind rattled the windows. Samuel sat beside her on the sofa, taking her swollen hands in his. "Then we'll manage on our own," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years. Ellen gave me some basic instructions just in case, and I've helped birth calves and foals. It's not exactly the same, but the principle is similar." Margaret managed a weak smile at his attempt to lighten the mood. "I hardly think comparing me to a cow is very romantic, husband. You're much prettier than any cow I've ever seen," Samuel replied, earning a genuine laugh from his wife. "And braver too. You're going to do fine, Margaret. We both are." That night, Margaret was awakened by a sharp pain across her lower back that took her breath away. She lay still for several minutes, hoping it was just another of the false alarms she had been experiencing for weeks. But when the pain returned with greater intensity, she knew their time had come. Samuel, she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. He had been sleeping lightly for days, alert to any change in her condition. He was awake immediately. Is it time? I think so, Margaret said, gripping his hand as another contraction built. The pains are getting stronger. Samuel lit the lamp and helped her into a sitting position. How long between them? Margaret concentrated, timing the next wave of pain. Maybe 10 minutes? It's hard to tell. All right, Samuel said, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. Let me get everything ready and then we'll see how you're progressing. He had prepared for this possibility, gathering clean linens, hot water, and the few medical supplies they had on hand. Ellen Bradley had given him detailed instructions during one of her visits, walking him through what to expect and how to help. Still, the reality of delivering his first child during a blizzard with no help was daunting. For the next several hours, Margaret labored while the wind howled outside their windows. Samuel stayed by her side, offering what comfort he could, and trying to remember everything Ellen had told him about the birthing process. Between contractions, they talked quietly about names and futures, about the life they would build for this child who was so eager to join them. I'm scared, Samuel, Margaret admitted during a brief rest between pains. Not of the birth, but of whether I'll be a good mother. I don't know anything about raising children. You'll be wonderful, Samuel assured her, smoothing damp hair back from her forehead. You're kind and patient and loving. Those are the most important things a child needs. The rest you can learn. As dawn approached, Margaret's labor intensified dramatically. The contractions came faster and harder, leaving her gasping and exhausted. Samuel could see the fear in her eyes as the pain overwhelmed her, and he felt helpless to ease her suffering. I can see the head, Samuel announced suddenly, his voice filled with awe despite the circumstances. Baby's coming, Margaret. You need to push. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Margaret bore down with the next contraction. Samuel positioned himself to catch the baby, his hands shaking with nerves and excitement. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only minutes, a tiny, slippery form slid into his waiting hands. It's a boy, Samuel breathed, staring down at the red-faced infant who was already beginning to cry lustily. Margaret, we have a son. The baby's first cries filled the small house, drowning out the sound of the wind outside. Samuel carefully cleaned the infant and wrapped him in the soft blankets Margaret had prepared, then placed him gently in his mother's arms. Margaret looked down at her son with tears streaming down her face. He was perfect, with a full head of dark hair and fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength. Hello, little Thomas, she whispered. I'm your mama, and this is your papa. Samuel felt his own eyes fill with tears as he looked at the child in Margaret's arms. This baby might not share his blood, but in every other way that mattered, he was Samuel's son. The love he felt for the tiny creature was immediate and overwhelming, stronger than anything he had ever experienced. Thomas Samuel Hartford, Samuel said softly, touching the baby's tiny fist. Welcome to the world, son. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the Hartford house, all was warmth and peace. Margaret nursed her son while Samuel tended to both mother and child, marveling at how natural it all felt despite his fears. By the time the blizzard finally blew itself out 2 days later, they had settled into the rhythm of new parenthood. When Ellen Bradley finally made it through the snowdrifts to check on them, she found a picture of domestic tranquility. Samuel was rocking baby Thomas while Margaret rested, both parents looking exhausted but radiantly happy. Well, I see you managed just fine without me, Ellen said with a smile, immediately reaching for the baby. What a handsome boy. He looks just like his papa. Samuel and Margaret exchanged a glance, both thinking of how true that statement might become as Thomas grew up shaped by Samuel's influence and love rather than genetics. He's a good baby, Samuel said proudly. Hardly cries unless he's hungry, and he's already sleeping for longer stretches at night. Ellen examined both mother and child thoroughly, pronouncing them both in excellent health. You did well, Samuel, she told him privately while Margaret dozed. Not every man could have managed what you did. Margaret and the baby are lucky to have you. As spring arrived and the snow melted into rushing streams, the Hartford family settled into their new routine. Samuel proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn with night feedings and diaper changes without complaint. He talked to Thomas constantly as he went about his daily chores, explaining ranch life to the infant who watched him with bright, alert eyes. Margaret recovered quickly from the birth, strengthened by good food and the peace of knowing her child was safe and loved. She watched Samuel with their son and marveled daily at the generosity of spirit that had led him to accept both her and her baby so completely. Do you ever regret it? She asked him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Thomas slept in her arms.
Taking on someone else's responsibility, I mean. Samuel considered her question seriously, as he always did.
No, he said finally. I've never thought of Thomas as someone else's responsibility. From the moment he was born into my hands, he became mine. Biology doesn't make a father, choice does, and I choose to be his father every day. Their neighbors seemed to accept the story of Margaret's widowhood without question. Thomas was welcomed into the community as Samuel Hartford's son, and no one questioned his right to the Hartford name or heritage. The boy thrived under the attention and love showered on him by both parents and the extended community family. As summer approached, Margaret found herself pregnant again. This time, there were no secrets or fears, only joy at the prospect of giving Samuel a child who would be biologically his own. When she told him the news, he swept her into his arms and spun her around the kitchen, laughing with pure happiness. "Thomas is going to be a big brother," Samuel said, grinning widely. "I hope he's ready for the competition." But there was never any competition in Samuel's love. As their family grew, his affection for Thomas only deepened. The boy became his constant companion, toddling along beside Samuel as he worked around the ranch and absorbing everything his father taught him about cattle, horses, and the land they called home. When little Elizabeth was born the following spring, Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, telling her stories in his broken toddler speech, and bringing her his favorite toys to share. Margaret watched her children together and marveled at how naturally they formed a family unit, bonded by love rather than complicated by questions of parentage. Samuel never treated his children differently. Both Thomas and Elizabeth were equally his, equally loved, equally important to his vision of the family's future. Thomas grew up knowing that his father had chosen to love him, which perhaps made that love even more precious than if it had been taken for granted. As the years passed, the story of Margaret's first marriage faded into the background of community memory. Thomas was known simply as Samuel Hartford's eldest son, heir to the growing ranch and beloved by everyone who knew him. The boy had his mother's quick wit and his father's steady temperament, growing into a child any parent would be proud to claim. Margaret often thought about Charles Whitmore and wondered if he ever regretted abandoning his son. Thomas was growing into a remarkable boy, intelligent, kind, hardworking, and loved. Charles had lost the chance to know this wonderful child, but his loss had become Samuel's gain and ultimately Thomas's good fortune. "Do you think he'll ever ask questions about his real father?" Margaret asked Samuel one evening as they watched 6-year-old Thomas teaching 3-year-old Elizabeth how to feed the chickens. "I am his real father," Samuel replied firmly. "If he asks about the man who helped create him, we'll tell him the truth in age-appropriate terms." But there's no question about who his real father is. Margaret squeezed his hand, still overwhelmed sometimes by the magnitude of his generosity. Samuel had not only saved her from disgrace and poverty, but had given her son something she could never have provided alone. A father's love and guidance, legitimacy in the eyes of the world, and a secure place in a family that valued him completely. The ranch had prospered over the years, growing from Samuel's modest beginning into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Thomas was already showing an aptitude for ranch work, following his father everywhere and absorbing knowledge about cattle, land management, and business. Samuel had begun talking about the day when Thomas would inherit the ranch, planning improvements and expansions with his son's future in mind. "This will all be yours someday," Samuel told Thomas one afternoon as they rode the range together, surveying their growing herd. "Yours and Elizabeth's both. I want you to understand what it means to build something that lasts, something you can pass on to your own children." Thomas, serious beyond his years, nodded solemnly. "I'll take good care of it, Papa. I promise." Samuel smiled at his son's earnestness. "I know you will, boy. You've got the heart for it." As they rode home that evening, Margaret watching from the porch as her husband and son approached the house, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. What had begun as a desperate deception had grown into something beautiful and lasting. Samuel had not only kept his promise to love her child as his own, but had exceeded every hope she had dared to nurture. Their love story was unconventional, built on forgiveness and choice rather than passion and romance. But it was real and deep and strong, the kind of love that weathers storms and grows stronger with time. And at the center of it all was Thomas, the child whose very existence had threatened to destroy Margaret's future, but had instead become the foundation of a happiness she had never thought possible. 20 years had passed since that snowy February night when Thomas Samuel Hartford was born into his father's hands during the Great Blizzard. The scared young woman who had stepped off the train in Cheyenne carrying secrets and shame
had grown into a confident ranch wife and mother, respected throughout the territory for her kindness and strength.
The small ranch that Samuel had built with his own hands had expanded into one of the largest cattle operations in Wyoming, employing dozens of men and spanning thousands of acres. Thomas, now 21, had grown into everything Samuel could have hoped for in a son. Tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with his mother's quick intelligence and compassionate heart, he had become Samuel's full partner in running the ranch. The community knew him as a young man of integrity and capability, someone who could be trusted with a handshake, and who treated everyone, from hired hands to wealthy cattle buyers, with equal respect. Elizabeth, now 18, had inherited her father's steady nature and her mother's beauty. She was being courted by the son of a neighboring rancher, a good young man named James Morrison, who had asked Samuel's permission to marry her. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and Thomas had already begun talking about building a house for the young couple on the far end of the Hartford land. On this particular autumn evening, the family gathered around the dinner table that Samuel had built when Thomas was still a baby. Margaret, now in her 40s but still beautiful, served a feast of roast beef, fresh bread, and vegetables from their garden. Samuel, his hair now silver at the temples, watched his children with obvious pride as they discussed the day's work and made plans for the winter ahead.
"The cattle prices in Denver are higher than they've been in years," Thomas reported, carving the roast with the same careful attention Samuel had taught him to apply to all tasks. "I think we should plan to drive the herd there in the spring instead of selling locally." "That's a long drive," Samuel noted.
"Are you prepared to manage it?" Thomas nodded confidently. "I've been planning the route and talking to some of the experienced trail bosses. Then Carter says he'll help me organize the drive if we decide to go ahead with it." Elizabeth looked up from helping their mother serve dinner. "James says his father might be interested in combining herds for the drive. It would be more efficient for both ranches." "That's good thinking," Samuel agreed.
"The Morrisons are good people. A partnership like that could benefit both families." Margaret watched the easy conversation between her husband and children, still sometimes marveling at how natural and normal their family life had become. There were no secrets now, no shadows from the past to cloud their happiness. Thomas had learned the truth about his parentage when he turned 16, told by parents who wanted him to hear it from them rather than discover it some other way. The conversation had taken place right here in this kitchen, with Samuel doing most of the talking while Margaret sat quietly, nervously awaiting their son's reaction. "You need to understand something about your beginning," Samuel had said, his voice serious but gentle. "Your mother was a young woman in trouble when she came here, carrying you, and with nowhere else to turn. Your biological father was a man who refused to take responsibility for you or for her." Thomas had listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than shocked. "So you're not my real father?" "I'm your real father, in every way that matters," Samuel had replied firmly. "The man who helped create you contributed nothing to who you are. I chose to love you, to raise you, to teach you everything I know about being a man. Biology is just a detail. Love and commitment are what make a father." "Does anyone else know?" Thomas had asked. "Ellen Bradley knows, and perhaps a few other old-timers who might remember your mother arriving here expecting. But to everyone in this community, you are my son, my heir, and my pride." "That will never change." Thomas had been quiet for several days after that conversation, processing the information and what it meant for his understanding of himself and his place in the family. But when he finally spoke about it again, it was to thank both his parents for their honesty and to reassure them that it changed nothing about his feelings for either of them. "You're the only father I've ever known or wanted," he had told Samuel. "And Ma, you were brave to come here and build a new life for us. I'm proud to be your son, both of you." Now, as Margaret watched her grown son discussing business with his father as an equal partner, she reflected on how completely Samuel had kept his promise to treat Thomas as his own child. There had never been any favoritism shown to Elizabeth, never any hint that Thomas was less cherished because he wasn't Samuel's biological child. If anything, Samuel seemed to take extra pride in Thomas's accomplishments, knowing that every good quality the young man possessed was the result of choice and nurture rather than inherited traits. After dinner, as Elizabeth helped clear the dishes and Thomas went to check on a horse that had thrown a shoe earlier, Margaret and Samuel sat on their front porch enjoying the cool evening air. The mountains in the distance were purple with autumn haze, and the sound of cattle lowing in the pastures created a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. "I got a letter today," Margaret said quietly, pulling an envelope from her apron pocket. "From Boston." Samuel looked at her with concern. Margaret rarely spoke of her past life, and correspondence from the East was unusual. "What kind of letter?" "It's from a lawyer representing the estate of Charles Whitmore.
Apparently he died last month. Margaret's voice was steady, but Samuel could see tension in the way she held her shoulders. Thomas's biological father? Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer.
Margaret nodded. According to the lawyer, Charles never married. He lived with his parents until they died, then alone until his death from consumption. The letter says he left instructions that if he died without legitimate heirs, an attempt should be made to locate any children he might have fathered and abandoned.
Samuel was quiet for a moment, processing this information. What does that mean for us? Nothing legally, Margaret said firmly. Thomas carries your name. He's your legal son in every way that matters. But the lawyer mentions that Charles left a considerable estate.
Apparently, the family business was quite successful. She paused, looking out at the ranch spread before them. The lawyer wants to know if Thomas might be interested in claiming an inheritance. What do you think we should tell him? Margaret considered the question carefully. I think we should tell him the truth and let him decide. He's a grown man now, old enough to make his own choices about his past and his future. They found Thomas in the barn, doctoring the injured horse with the gentle competence Samuel had taught him. He looked up as his parents approached, immediately noticing the serious expressions on their faces. Is everything all right? He asked, setting down his tools.
Margaret handed him the letter. This came today.
I think you should read it. Thomas read the letter carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with each paragraph. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to his mother. So the man who sired me is dead, he said matter-of-factly. And now his lawyers want to give me his money. It appears so, Samuel replied. What are your thoughts about it? Thomas was quiet for several minutes, stroking the horse's neck while he considered the implications. I suppose there's a part of me that's curious about him, he admitted finally, about what kind of man abandons a woman carrying his child. But mostly, I feel sorry for him. He missed out on knowing his son, and from the sound of it, he lived a pretty lonely life because of the choices he made. The inheritance could be substantial, Margaret pointed out. Enough to expand the ranch significantly, or to set you up independently if that's what you want. Thomas shook his head decisively. I don't want anything from him. I already have everything I need, a father who taught me how to be a man, a mother who sacrificed everything to give me a chance at a good life, and land that we've built together with our own hands. What could his money give me that would be more valuable than that? Samuel felt his chest tighten with pride and emotion.
You don't have to decide right away, son.
Take some time to think about it. I don't need time, Thomas said firmly. I know who I am and where I belong. I'm Thomas Hartford, son of Samuel and Margaret Hartford. That dead man in Boston means nothing to me. If he has money to distribute, let it go to someone who needs it more than we do. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to her son's words. The scared, desperate woman who had boarded that train so many years ago had dreamed of acceptance and safety for her unborn child. She could never have imagined that he would grow up so secure in his identity, so confident in his place in the world. I'm proud of you, Samuel told Thomas, gripping his shoulder with a firm hand. Not because you're turning down the money, but because you know your own worth. That's the mark of a man who's been raised right. Later that evening, Margaret wrote a response to the Boston lawyer, politely declining any claim on Charles Whitmore's estate, and requesting that no further contact be made. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a sense of closure about the past that had haunted her for so long. Charles Whitmore had missed out on knowing the remarkable young man his son had become. Thomas was everything a father could want: honest, hardworking, compassionate, and strong. He was a leader in the community, respected by men twice his age for his judgment and integrity. He would make an excellent husband to whichever young woman eventually caught his heart, and someday he would be a wonderful father to his own children. All of this had been possible because Samuel Hartford had made the extraordinary choice to love another man's child as completely as if Thomas were his own flesh and blood. Their family had been built not on the accident of birth, but on the deliberate decision to choose love over convention, compassion over judgment. As autumn turned to winter and the family prepared for Elizabeth's spring wedding, Thomas took on more responsibility for the ranch operations. He handled negotiations with cattle buyers, managed the hiring of seasonal workers, and made decisions about land purchases and improvements. Samuel still provided guidance and advice, but increasingly he was able to step back and watch his son take the lead. He's ready, Samuel told Margaret one evening as they watched Thomas settle a dispute between two of the hired hands with diplomatic skill. In a few years, I'll be able to retire and leave the ranch entirely in his hands. What will you do with yourself when you're not working from dawn to dusk? Margaret teased. Spoil my grandchildren, Samuel replied with a grin.
And maybe take my beautiful wife on that trip to San Francisco we've been talking about for years. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibilities. Their love story, which had begun with desperation and deception, had grown into something solid and lasting. They had built more than just a successful ranch. They had created a legacy of love that would continue through their children and their children's children. Thomas would someday tell his own children about their grandfather Samuel, the man who had chosen to love a child who wasn't his own blood, and who had shown them all what it meant to build a family on foundation of choice rather than chance.
The Hartford name would carry forward not because of genetics, but because of the values Samuel had instilled and the example he had set. On Christmas morning that year, as the family gathered around the tree Thomas and Samuel had cut from their own land, Margaret looked at her husband and children and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. The scared young woman who had stepped off the train in Cheyenne all those years ago had found more than just safety and acceptance. She had found a love that had transformed not just her life, but the lives of everyone it touched. Samuel caught her looking at him and reached over to squeeze her hand.
"What are you thinking about?" he asked softly.
"Just how blessed we are," Margaret replied, watching Thomas help Elizabeth open her presents while the fire crackled merrily in the fireplace.
All of us. Yes, Samuel agreed, looking around at the family they had built together. We are indeed blessed. Outside, snow was falling gently over the Wyoming prairie, covering the ranch in peaceful white.
But inside the Hartford house, surrounded by the warmth of a love that had conquered every obstacle placed before it, the future looked bright with promise and hope.